Stephen Chrisomalis, who's relatively new to our campus, but already has begun to make a discernibly positive impact on the reputations of the anthropology department and the linguistics program. I know for sure that Steve has earned the reputation of an excellent professor of anthropological linguistics. His students speak glowingly of him and talk about the intellectual excitement that he engenders in them. Thankfully, Liliana, thank you so much. The linguistics administration has been merciful enough to me to schedule my sociolinguistics classes on different days and times from Steve's. Otherwise, my classes would all be canceled for lack of enrollment. I expect that Steve will soon earn a presidential teaching award. And he's also made an impact on the mathematics community, as this talk shows. He will talk today on the concept of greatness in the Math Corps family. Steve is an assistant professor of anthropology at Wayne, and is also the graduate director in that department. He earned his PhD in anthropology in 2003 from McGill University in Montreal. And if you know anything about Canadian universities, you know that that's one of the top universities in that country. He was also a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the University of Toronto and at McGill before coming to Wayne State University in 2008. He's a linguistic anthropologist whose work bridges cognitive, political, and social perspectives on the language-culture intersection, especially focusing on mathematics and number systems. His book, Numerical Notation, A Comparative History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, and you know that's an excellent press, was a finalist for the Edward Sapir Prize in Linguistic Anthropology, and that is a coveted award. His new book, entitled Human Expeditions, inspired by Bruce Trigger, is forthcoming this spring from the University of Toronto Press. He is the author of 12 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He has presented, and I'm so thankful to him, his work at the Humanities Center twice previously. In 2008, he discussed his project Stop to Direction on linguistic ideologies in the Stop Signs of Montreal, Quebec. And in 2012, he discussed his sociolinguistic research on transformations in the English numerical system. Since 2009, he has been engaged in a long-term ethnographic research with the Math Corps program at Wayne State University, focusing on mathematical discourse, linguistic standardization, and social norms. In 2010, he appeared on the Discovery Channel's Weird or What, commenting on linguistic aspects of the Voynich manuscript. In his spare time, what spare time? He is the author of that academic blog, Glossopgraphia, and rare book website, Frontistory. So on this very cold day, please give a warm welcome to Professor Stephen Chrisomalis.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to everyone. I want to thank everyone who's been able to come. I'm especially pleased to see Dean Raskin here. I'm especially pleased to see members of my Math Corps family who are able to come out today. It's fantastic to see you. I want to thank my students who came out today, those of you who I obliged to come, and those of you who are here of your own volition. And of course, to my colleagues and to friends of the Humanities Center, welcome to you all. So today I'm going to talk about my research, which has been ongoing since 2008-2009 with the Math Corps program. And this was research that was initiated under the guiding wisdom of Bob Thomas, who, when I came to interview here at Wayne State, said, "Have you heard of the Math Corps?" and showed me a video that changed my life. And so I want to talk to you just very briefly. For some of you I know nothing about the Math Corps, and some of you live Math Corps. And so just very, very briefly, The Math Corps is a mathematics enrichment program here at Wayne State. It was founded in 1992 by Professor Stephen Kahn. And it serves Detroit public and charter school students starting in the 7th grade throughout high school and then on to their lives in college and beyond. About 95% of the student population of Math Corps are African American students, and that's representative of the Detroit public school and charter school system as a whole. The participants range enormously in mathematical preparation, ranging from several grades below grade level to at or above grade level when they come in. The core of the program operates as a 6-week summer camp, and then there are Saturday programs and special events that occur year-round. This is a very technical description of a place that is very different than this on the ground, but I think it's an accurate description as far as it goes. But there would be nothing from this description to distinguish the Math Corps from any number of mathematics enrichment programs that operate on college and university campuses throughout the country. And my point today and my goal today is to make the case that it is different, but that why it's different is not immediately evident. So my central research question going into my research was how does the Math Corps program motivate student success within a local community of mathematical practice? And I came into the program as a specialist in the anthropology and in the linguistics of mathematics, with the idea that what I was going to do was study all the wonderful things, the wonderful ways that Math Corps teachers and TAs inspire kids to love math. But on my very first day in camp, I learned something that everybody learns in Math Corps very, very early. And this is maybe a bit of a state secret that I'm revealing here, but Math Corps really isn't about math. And ultimately, I think there are different presentations I could give where I talk about mathematical practice, mathematical cognition, transmission of mathematical knowledge between staff and students and among students. And I could do that, but I don't think it's actually the central point to understanding student success. So if my goal is to answer the central research question I set out before me, I really have to do something else. I need to explain a different phenomenon, which is what motivates student success in general, and set the math aside. So as an autobiographical note, this has been a learning experience for me over the past 4 years as I've moved my research from strictly mathematical subjects into some greater diversity. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about greatness. I'm going to talk about the word greatness, and I'm going to talk about the language of greatness, but I'm going to talk about greatness also as a concept. And as I'm going to make the case, this is a really fundamental concept to understanding the way that Math Corps works and the way that Math Corps staff and students think about success. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify some patterns in discourse, that is, different ways of talking about greatness that occur at Math Corps. And then I'm going to understand these as a cultural model. And I'll talk about that briefly for the anthropologists in the crowd who'd like to hear about that. But then I'm going to compare these patterns with the way that greatness is conceptualized in general American English. Because it's insufficient to simply say that Math Corps does X. But in fact, to show if Math Corps is different, then there has to be X versus Y. And there has to be a comparison that shows that what Math Corps does is actually different than what people do in general American English. I think it's important to demonstrate that not only that staff talk about greatness in a particular way, but that students acquire ways of talking about greatness that parallel those directly. In other words, to demonstrate cultural transmission. If you're going to explain student success, this needs to be the case. Fourth, I'm going to link this cultural model, which is largely about language, to some nonverbal, gestural, and graphic ways of talking about and thinking about greatness. And lastly, I want to talk not just about all the external stuff, but I want us to try to get inside the minds of kids within Math Corps and identify aspects of this cultural model that are actually motivating and underlying their academic and personal success. Okay, so as I said very briefly, I'm going to give a theoretical outline, and I'm coming from a perspective as a linguistic anthropologist where I'm transcending the two disciplines and working at all those places where they intersect. My anthropological inspiration for the discussion today is the work done in cognitive anthropology on cultural models. So people like Dorothy Holland, Naomi Quinn, Claudia Strauss, Roy D'Andrade. And this body of work really sees local knowledge and beliefs framed in a systematic way, shaping action and decision making. But I'm not using this alone, but I'm using it with a branch of linguistics that sometimes goes under the name conceptual metaphor theory or cognitive metaphor theory or cognitive linguistics. And George Lakoff is probably the most prominent figure behind that. These two bodies of research are actually closely interlinked and have been for over 20 years, but I think actually of late they've become more and more separate. In the late 80s and early 90s, it would have been accepted that linguists and anthropologists were really doing the same thing under a different name, and these people published together quite often. And they've stopped doing that, which is a little puzzling to me, because I think it's a very powerful way of understanding metaphorical phenomena. And Lakoff really emphasizes that one of the ways that we understand any phenomenon is by looking at metaphors and looking at what they entail. What do they say about the world? It asks us to ask the question, if a person is talking like this, what kind of phenomena do they think they're talking about? And so really we're asking, what kind of phenomenon is greatness from the MathCore cultural model? And so this is the question I'm going to investigate today. Now, a word on methodology. So the first methodology I've been using it for the past 4 years. I'll continue to use it at MathCore for as long as they'll let me. If they let me keep coming back, I'll keep coming back. I've done over 500 hours of observation, of participant observation of all settings, classroom settings, social settings, a variety of settings between 2008 and 2012. And this may look like just hanging out, and I know at MathCore they thought, what the heck is this guy doing, just hanging out and sitting with the kids? And, but this is the method of participant observation, and it works quite well as a means of generating hypotheses and ideas about why people do what they do. Second, semi-structured interviews. So I've conducted 136 interviews with 57 program participants. That includes both students and staff. Some of that is about math and asking kids to solve mathematical problems and then talking to them about how they got the answers they got. But a lot of it is also on social topics, about how they came into the program, what their feelings are about the program, how they think the program has changed what they do and how they live their lives. And so this is the main part of the topic I'm going to talk about today, are these social issues. The last thing I'm doing today, and which both to my anthropological colleagues and to my MathCore family may seem a little odd, is that I'm using some methods from a discipline called corpus linguistics, where what I'm going to be doing is looking at words and looking at words in context to analyze large amounts of linguistic data, to identify and analyze these concepts and compare, most importantly, what's going on at MathCore to what's going on outside MathCore in other English contexts. So this part is much more quantitative, so I would call this a mixed method study. It incorporates both quantitative and qualitative analysis of data. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the assembly corpus, but to do that I need to talk to you about what an assembly is. If you were to come any weekday during MathCore camp, during the 6-week camp, every morning you go into the DeRoy auditorium and you go down and you would see some organized chaos lasting between 15 and 80 minutes. And these are daily structured inspirational and solidarity building events. They involve everything from recognition of student success to little jokes and plays that are put on, and songs, and motivational videos, and all sorts of things. But also, a key thing that I'm going to talk about today is there's a lot of moral and social discourse from staff, where staff talk to students about their experiences, about their lives, about the things that underpin success and failure in life. And this is the portion of the assemblies that I'm most interested in today. So I've observed 71 assemblies, which range in length from 15 to 80 minutes. It has a very, very long tail, so I'm using a median as the appropriate mean. So the median is about 35 minutes, so we can ignore all those times when some people who shall remain nameless may have gone on for 70 or 80 minutes or so. You can tell them I said that. And the only portions of the assemblies that I've transcribed are ones in which there's a single staff member on stage addressing the entire assembly. And so all of the other parts, the parts with jokes and plays, and these are not the parts I'm considering today. But what we have left is a corpus, which we'll call the assembly corpus, of 74,463 words, which is about 10 hours of constant discourse, which is spoken by 4 members, and 2 of the assemblies didn't have this form of discourse in them, the other 69 did. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about this comparative corpus data, and I'm using 2 corpora. The first is the sublexis corpus. It's 51 million words of word frequencies that are actually taken from TV and movie subtitles from American English contexts. And this is a corpus that's primarily used to measure word frequencies, and so when I'm talking about word frequencies, I'll be using this corpus. But the more important one I'm using is the Corpus of Contemporary American English, or COCA. And COCA basically collects 425 million words, spoken and written, in American English between 1990 and 2011. That is to say, recent modern American English. And so the total corpus is 425 million words, which is an awful lot of words. And then I'll also be considering a particular subcorpus, which is just the spoken word corpus, because we know that what people say and how people write are in fact quite different forms of using the English language. And so because the assemblies are spoken, the spoken corpus is the relevant comparison. All right. All right, so now let's have a look at some data. So what this is a chart showing you words that are of exceptionally high frequency in the assembly corpus. So what we're seeing here is this is the number of instances in the first column of each of the particular words. And then I use this WPM, linguists use this concept, which is basically words per million. And so, and then I've compared that to the frequency of those same words in the sublexis general American English corpus. And then I've constructed a ratio. And so basically the rightmost column in each case basically compares the words per million at MathCore to the words per million in general American English. And so in general, a word with a frequency of 1,000 words per minute, given ordinary speaking rates, is spoken roughly once every 10 minutes. In other words, at MathCore, because we're approaching 3,000, if you were to go to an assembly, you'd hear greatness talked about approximately once every 3 to 4 minutes. That's a lot of greatness, okay? But my point is not that it's really, just that it's really common. I think anybody coming into MathCore would recognize that there's a lot of talk about greatness, but that it is 674 times more frequent at MathCore than in general American English. So the key there is the ratio between the two. And we can see that there are a lot of other words. Unsurprisingly, math and core are a lot more common at MathCore than they are in general American English. And there are also some key concepts like kindness and compassion and courage, about which I could give an entirely different paper, but I won't. So now I want to contrast that with some ordinary frequency words. And this is just to show that I haven't cooked my data here, that there actually are quite a lot of words that occur at a ratio of about 1 to 1. So words like okay and believe and remember and parents and work and good and question occur at roughly the same rate at MathCore as they do outside MathCore, considering these assemblies. It's not to say that they're rare. People talk about these words all the time in MathCore, but that they're no more common in MathCore than without. And so note also that greatness is more common than any of the other words. So it's more common, the word greatness is spoken more often than the word okay at MathCore. That actually is quite astonishing. Greatness is not, at 4 words per million in general English. It's pretty rare, but in MathCore it's extraordinarily common. But here's the thing, that doesn't really tell us that much. That's an interesting first data point, but it doesn't really tell us that much. It just tells us that there's this verbal habit. Now, I want to move on and talk a little bit about this idea of conceptual metaphor. So what I did is I looked at each of the 210 instances of greatness in the assembly corpus, and I coded it according to a set of conceptual relationships. These are not specific words, but they're specific ways of thinking about greatness that occur with a high degree of frequency. So for instance, when I use this capitalized phrase, greatness is universal, that doesn't mean that literally someone said greatness is universal. In fact, I don't think anyone ever said greatness is universal in the assembly corpus. But if you say something like, everyone has greatness in them, or all people have greatness, or each person has greatness. Now these things are said very often. And these are all linguistic instances under the general concept, greatness is universal. Or similarly, greatness is a path. You could also say, well, there could also be the road to greatness. And that's the same general conceptual relationship. And so this is the conceptual metaphor framework that George Lakoff and others in linguistics have used to think about how language relates to concepts. And as you can see, 71% of the total instances of greatness have at least, of the word greatness, have at least one of these, and only 29% don't. And even those that don't, maybe a sentence that doesn't have any conceptual relationship could be, let's talk about greatness. Well, that doesn't have any of those relationships.
Are those percentages on the right meant to add up to 100?
No, they're not.
Okay.
And
okay.
For exactly the reason that I'm just about to show you,
okay.
that in fact many sentences have multiple instances of the same...
There's some intersection.
Absolutely, and I'm about to show you some really neat data that really show the way that these interrelate. So this is just a chart showing the number of conceptual relations for embodied in each of the 210 sentences that have the word greatness in them. And as you can see, that does add up to 210 and 100%. But this one won't, because if there are multiple instances in the same sentence, then it's not going to add up. All right.
Glad to hear that.
All right. So, enough charts for a while. Let me give you some, let's talk about some words. Let's talk about some text. So here are some examples of actual sentences from the assembly corpus that the 4 individuals on staff had said. And if you're lucky in life, you will find your greatness through ups and downs. So this embodies both the idea that greatness is found, but it's also that it's a struggle. And similarly, we could turn to another one. If you believe in a child's greatness, then you have to demand to see it. And we see that this both involves the idea that greatness is something that's believed in, that it's something that staff demand of students, and then the students show it so that it's visible. And so that we see that these actually create sentences that have a rich interplay of these 8 key conceptual metaphors or relationships. In another example, each one of you has greatness in you. Now this may strike you that this doesn't actually have much metaphor in it, but it certainly does, because it conceptualizes greatness as a universal, something that's in everyone, and that it's within a person. This is not necessary. We do not have to conceptualize greatness as an entity that exists within a person. And the fact that they regularly do at Math Corps suggests that something interesting is going on. All right. Now, I also want to turn back to a chart for a minute to talk a little bit more about this idea as greatness as an individual quality or something that is possessed by a person. And so what I did is I took my 210 sentences and I looked at some key pronouns that one would use to identify whether greatness is seen as a property of a person. And so for instance, instances of the pronouns his, her, your, or our preceding greatness, 51, or with the intervening word own, really doubly suggesting that it is a possession or quality of a person, 12 more, and then turning it around using a prepositional phrase, greatness in, inside, or within one of these pronouns, another 29. But then note that there are lots of things that are never talked about. So for instance, its greatness, its own greatness, The greatness inside it are never talked about. And greatness inside any other noun phrase, referring to any abstract quantity, any abstract concept, it would be nonsensical to talk about, at Math Corps, to talk about the greatness of Math Corps. Nobody ever says Math Corps has greatness inside it. That's weird. And it's weird particularly because greatness is a property of individuals who show their own, who show the greatness that's inside them. Now, so now I'm going to just summarize that what I'm calling this is a cultural model for greatness. Because it's an entity within a person, it must be found. It's not evident, and so it must be shown visibly. And how do you show it? You show it through action. Actions show the greatness that's inside of you. But it's not that some people have greatness and other people don't. It's inside all people, which means that it's not unrealistic for staff to believe in a student's greatness and demand a student's greatness. If Math Corps staff believed that only some kids have greatness inside them and others, well, they got some okayness, then this would be a problem. Because you couldn't demand it without putting an unrealistic burden on some vulnerable children in an educational setting. And so you say, even when you're not showing it, I know you have this greatness inside you. I believe it's there. And I demand to see it. And you see how these metaphors fit together in a system of entailments, that they entail each other. And that we also know that it is a struggle. So we know it's not always shown, but because it's universal, there's always a path to greatness. So basically, this is a moral model for the world. This is a way of thinking about how one can behave and what you have inside you that lets you behave in appropriate ways and act in ways that are going to be positive and successful. Now, the question I alluded to before. How do we know if the Math Corps way of speaking about greatness is unusual or special? What are the metaphors and the relationships that exist in other English language contexts? Well, now let's look at some stuff from American English and from English in general. The word great actually has two very distinct senses. The first is that greatness is bigness. That when I say something is great, I usually mean it's good, but if I say that something is a great big something, in fact, I'm actually saying that it's just very big. And of course, we all know that, so these two semantic senses are intertwined. Greatness as bigness. In fact, the Old English sense of great was actually coarse, and it's actually the same word as grit. That grit is basically, not sand, which is very fine, but it's a little more gritty because it's a little more great in that sense. And then in Middle English, there was, in Chaucer and around that time, there was this very common set phrase, an idiomatic phrase, a great heart. And when you say he has a great heart, what you mean is that someone is big or full of positive emotion. And actually, this is actually very similar in a lot of ways to the Math Corps model, but it's going to differ in some ways that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Now, this greatness versus bigness offers some opportunity for playfulness. So here is a quotation from The Simpsons from 1994, and there's an episode where Homer is thought to have committed an act of sexual harassment. And so a group of people have congregated outside his home, and they're protesting, and they say, 2, 4, 6, 8, Homer's crime was very great. And then there's this pause as if they're thinking. And then they say, great meaning large or immense. We use it in the pejorative sense. And this is in fact a playfulness of the fact that greatness has these two key semantic contexts. To say that it's very great, they weren't saying, oh, it wasn't that it was such a great crime, that, it was that it was such a great crime.
Could have done better right there.
All right. Last, and this will be familiar to many of you, perhaps the most important discussion of greatness in literature comes from Twelfth Night. In my stars, I am above me, but be not. I'm above thee, but be not afraid of greatness. Some are become great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And so these are some of the ways that in pre-modern English and in contemporary English that greatness is talked about. Now, another phrase I want to briefly mention is the phrase destined for greatness, because this is another idiomatic phrase that's used quite often. And so what this is, this chart is from the Google Ngram Viewer, which is a fantastic tool if you just like to play around with words and play around with word frequencies and language. But what this is essentially showing is that prior to 1900, the phrase destined for greatness was essentially, if not completely absent, then largely absent from the English language. And then over the 20th century, experienced quite a meteoric rise. So, in other words, prior to the 20th century, you would basically almost never hear anyone talking or writing about being destined for greatness. But it's really undergone, well, at least a tenfold increase, if not more. All that data from the 19th century is a lot spottier, but it's certainly not, it's certainly at least a tenfold increase over the past 100 years or so. Okay, so here are some things that greatness can be. Greatness can be achieved, greatness can be thrust upon you, or you can be destined for greatness in English. And so what I did was I went to my COCA database. And what the COCA database lets you do is it lets you find collocates, which are basically words that are associated with other words, before or after them. And so I wanted to look first of all at verbs. I wanted to say, what kind of verbs do people talk about in general American English when they talk about greatness? As in Twelfth Night, we know they talk about achieving greatness. We also know that people talk about being destined for greatness. And so what I did was I took the 1973 instances of greatness from the COCA corpus, and I looked at the fraction, the percentage of each of those that uses, I wanted to look at what are the most common verbs. So these are the most common verbs that are associated with greatness, other than the verb to be, which we sort of set aside as a sort of special kind of verb that we don't worry about. How do people talk about greatness in spoken American English? And there you see it right at the top. Achieve, destined, measure, lie, thrust, define, aspire, and restore. And then look on the right-hand side, you see that basically these are almost entirely absent from Math Corps. In fact, it would be nonsensical to say that someone achieves greatness at Math Corps, because greatness is already inside of you. It's not there to be achieved. You can do great things, and those things can show your greatness, but it's not about achieving greatness. And similarly, it's not about aspiring to greatness, because you already have greatness inside of you. Only once and only one time did I hear anyone ever use the phrase destined for greatness, and I think that was just a verbal slip-up or a tick. I think that would be highly, highly unusual in a Math Corps context, and as you see, all of these are virtually absent. So what's very common in spoken American English is very, very rare in Math Corps. So then I said, okay, well that's great, so those are some verbs. Well, what about nouns? And so what I looked at is, what are some of the nouns that are associated with greatness in American English? And here they are. America, country, nation, God. Now remember, at Math Corps, you can't talk about the greatness of any abstract concept or any entity other than a human being. There is no discussion. None of the 210 instances talk about the greatness of Math Corps, or the greatness of Wayne State University, or the greatness of America, or the greatness of Detroit Public Schools, or the greatness of anything else other than a person. In general American English, America, country, nation, and God are, with some frequency, talked about. Unsurprisingly, those are entirely absent, but in fact, any other abstract concept or concrete noun other than other than a human being is never talked about this way at Math Corps. All right, moving right along. So here we have then, in contrast, the American English cultural model for greatness, as opposed to, in contrast with the Math Corps model. Greatness is not universal to all humans, so you can aspire to it or it can be restored. If you have greatness, then it can't be restored because it's already there. So at Math Corps, you can't talk about these things in this way without violating the cultural model that exists. Because it's a property of actions that are achieved rather than individuals, we can talk about achieving greatness. And rather than seeing it as a struggle or a path, as something that might have some ups and downs, you could be destined for greatness or have it thrust upon you, as if to suggest that no matter what you do, regardless of your actions, the greatness is just there, it just happens. And at Math Corps, they would say, well, okay, you have greatness inside you, but that's not enough. That's the starting point, that you have to then recognize that there's a path to greatness, and it involves showing your greatness because others expect it of you, they believe it of you, now show it to me. And this is the way in which the discourse about greatness at Math Corps differs systematically from any other context I've been able to find in ordinary American English. Okay, now it would still be possible at this point for you to say, well, that's fine, there are 4 staff members who say all this stuff, and I just don't really care what those 4 people say. That those 4 people aren't interesting, and that's true. As people go, they're wonderful people, but I really want to know, what do the students say? And so that's where I turn to my semi-structured interviews and think about and see what students produce when they talk about greatness. Now, of course, because I'm a semi-competent ethnographer, when I figured out that greatness was important, I added a question about greatness. Tell me about greatness. But I'm not going to tell you about that, because I think that's just priming the students a lot, and a lot of what I'm about to show you actually duplicates that exactly. But this comes from a different set of questions. Questions I ask before I ever get to talking about greatness with the student, because I don't want to prime them, and I don't want to prompt them in a way that gets them thinking about, oh, what did Professor Kahn say about greatness today? And if I ask somebody, what do you know about greatness, that's what a Math Corps student is going to think. So instead, I and my research assistant, Monica Rodriguez, ask questions like, so what are the values that Math Corps represents to you? And here's Paul. All the names of students have been changed. Paul's 18 and male at the time of this interview. And he says, well, the values would be just the idea of like greatness, looking at people through the eyes of greatness. So showing that conceptual metaphor of greatness being visible. And then he goes on to say, like, rather than always assuming the worst out of people, it does make a difference, just assuming the best and then questioning why they may be messing up. And it helps. It changes your perception of people. And this very fundamentally represents the idea that everyone has greatness within them, and rather than assume that if they screw up it's because they don't have greatness within them, it's looking at them in a different way. Now, Paul, at age 18, is in his 6th or 7th year in the program, and so we might say, well, look, he's been in it too long. He's just doing what the staff are doing because he's been exposed to such a great degree. Most students who come to Math Corps come for 3 years, and then they're gone. What about those students? Well, let's look at a couple of those students. Here's another question. The same interviewer, Monica, and the same question. And here's Jerome. Jerome, who's 13, male, says, well, Math Corps is a big family, pretty much seems like one. Agree? If you know a lot of people, and they pretty much start to become a family, and they tell you that greatness is the key, and I do believe that everyone has greatness in them. And so this is an interview that occurs in Jerome's 2nd year in the program. And you're like, okay, well, 2 years, that's a pretty long time still. Maybe he's just learned all this. Well, here is Octavia. It's a slightly different question, and I'm the interviewer. I'm a terrible interviewer, by the way. I keep asking these long questions that go on and on and on and on. Those of you who know me are completely unsurprised by this. But anyway, so I asked this long question, and then Octavia says, who's 12, says, oh, when Professor Kahn was telling about how we're all special and nobody is like, and how there's like a certain path to greatness, you don't like automatically go there. You know, take little steps and things. That really touched me. I felt really home with that. This was an interview, and this was Octavia's 9th day in the Math Corps program. And so what we're seeing is that people are using these conceptual relationships that are embodied in the Math Corps cultural model very, very rapidly. And they're not using it because they're being prompted to ask them what greatness is. But they're doing it when they're asked a general question about things that are important, or things that matter to them, or things that matter in the program. And so I think this is a key point that's worthy of our consideration. Here are some other things. This is not from my data set, but this is from the Math Corps website. But again, and so these are some testimonials or material from student journals that's been put up online. And again, we see, I finally found my greatness, and it shows us our greatness. We can even find this same form of discourse and these same conceptual relationships in other media such as Twitter. So here is a a tweet from November 2011, and this is a male TA, that's a high school student from the Detroit Public Schools, and he's tweeting to another male TA. So these are two males, 15, 16 years old, talking to one another on Twitter. I ain't never doing that. I'm going to be myself. He will recognize my greatness. And Math Corps agreement is a Math Corps sign or signal. I'll be talking about those in just a second. But the key here is that this is 3 months after camp is over. This is two young men in Detroit Public Schools who are talking about greatness using this Math Corps cultural model, which is virtually absent. Remember, recognize and see and visible, these were not in the American English cultural model. And so what we're seeing here is a common way of understanding what greatness is and how it's meant to work. All right, now, going beyond that, the Math Corps program is characterized by a rich gestural inventory, and these are called signals in Math Corps. But so, for instance, this would be to agree or to applaud. This would be to support. This would be to disagree. This one is for a funny joke. There's a variety of signals. And participants in the program rapidly learn that Math Corps values are not just learned through language, but they're also learned gesturally. Another thing is that Math Corps' program space, if you were to go up to State Hall, 2nd or 3rd floor of State Hall, or go to DeRoy Auditorium in the summer, you would see hundreds upon hundreds of works of art, inspirational quotations, mathematical information posted on the walls. And so there, last year there were 274 of these. I know because I took photos of them all. And these also shape what people know and what people think about Math Corps. Now, why is this relevant to the concept of greatness? Well, first of all, there's what we could call the greatness gesture. And this is, and so basically, the greatness gesture is a co-speech gesture. It occurs in conjunction with speech, and it's a way of representing greatness visually and gesturally. And so I'm going to read this, which is from the assembly corpus, and I've notated it with a couple of gestures. Greatness, for those of you who've been here know this, greatness is not this. The road to greatness is not this. The road to greatness is this. Always down, always down, always down. But generally, the trend is always up. Everybody getting that? There's a mathematical description for that I don't or can't go into now because it's actually complicated. Well, it's calculus, it's stuff like that, maximum points and inflection points and stuff like that. But I will tell you that we are all human, and note this, because we're all human, we're all failures. Now this does not sound like motivational discourse. What kind of program goes and tells kids that they're all failures? Well, I'll tell you what kind, because this is absolutely critical to the point I'm going to make. It's a program that recognizes that life is a struggle, and that life has its ups and downs, and that the road to greatness is not this, but it's this. All right. Now, here's another thing. This is from my visual, one of the 274. And you know, I should really find out who the artist is on this, because I use it all the time now, because it's so wonderful. And I know who the photographer was. I don't know who the artist was, though. But here's a visual representation of the greatness gesture. We see that the road to greatness has its ups and downs, but generally the trend is always up, you know, despite the struggles. All right. And that brings us back to greatness as bigness. So the cultural model at Math Corps is not simply that, you know, greatness is universal or greatness is within a person, but that greatness is good, greatness is goodness, because it's always characterized by positive action. But showing your greatness is about that path upwards. It's about motivating students to a path of constant improvement despite failure, despite the lack of success. And so greatness is not just about being good, but there is a metaphorical concept of bigness, of max-min points and all those inflection points and all of that stuff. But the idea is that throughout a student's life, they should always work towards showing their greatness recognizing that it's not always going to show, but that through their lives they're going to show more and more of the greatness that is within them. And so what these gestural and graphic modalities are doing is they're reinforcing that greatness is goodness and greatness is bigness, this upward journey or path towards showing your potential. Now, you could be following me all to this point and say, okay, sure, but I still want to know, why should I care? How does this motivate action? So you could reasonably ask, how does this greatness cultural model motivate positive action and student success? And how can we establish that it's cognitively salient, that it's important for how people think, and not just a linguistic habit, how people talk? Maybe you're like, I'm with you already, but I'm here to tell you that there's another way we can look at this, and it involves going back to the data and going back to that corpus data. So one of the things I noted looking at the greatness cultural model is that the word greatness is 674 times more common in Math Core as without, but that the word great is actually not especially common. It's very slightly more common, at 1.5 times more common. But that great is that, so for instance, staff at Math Core very, very frequently will tell students that you have greatness inside you. And I demand it and I want to show you. But they very rarely tell students that you're great. Now, if this was just a verbal tick and people were just saying the word great and greatness all over the place, just as a way of peppering their speech with something that they kind of randomly hoped would work out in some sort of way, you would expect that great would be pretty common. You know, because you have greatness in you, I know you're great. But people don't talk about that, about greatness that way at Math Core. And I ran a chi-square there. For those of you who like chi-squares, there it is. As you see, I've got a nice little p-value for those of you who like numbers, which I do. But that's not the point. The point is that greatness is very, very common relative to English, and great is not particularly common at Math Core compared to the rest of English. But here's the thing. Being great is a state. It's a state of being. When you say you're great, you're describing a person as a way of saying, you know, you're intelligent, or you're short, or you're fat, or whatever. And great is being great is a positive state, but showing and finding greatness is a process. So the key insight here is that greatness is processual, because it's not about, you know, your greatness always showing through or always shining. It's a recognition that this is a path and it's a struggle. And because it's inside you, it's not always evident, but you've got to show it to me, which is why I expect it of you and which I demanded of you. And there's been quite a lot of research in social psychology. Carol Dweck is probably the one who's behind this initially, who emphasized that for students, it's important to emphasize their success to their effort, that is, to the process that they work through, rather than their innate ability. And so Dweck worked with a lot of high-achieving students and basically showed that because they were constantly given positive reinforcement of the form of, you're so smart, you're so wonderful, that they actually, when they were faced with any sort of challenge, they didn't know how to respond to that because it conflicted with their cultural model, which is that I'm great. Well, if I'm great, why aren't I showing my greatness? So Math Core evades this problem by not telling kids very often that they're great. It's not that they don't think they're great, they do. But if Math Core staff were to go around telling kids they're great all the time, it wouldn't accomplish the very fundamental goal, which is to recognize that they're in a math program, lots of these kids are 3, 4 grades below grade level, and that they're not going to get it right away. They're not always going to be perfect. And so greatness being within you, even when you're not showing it, is a very powerful processual way of allowing children to understand where they're at, and it recognizes, remember that that was the quote, we're all failures, that we're all going to mess up, and that that's okay. Recognizing that inevitability encourages a mindful attitude towards challenges. It encourages kids to reflect. Well, I screwed up, but you know what? Next time I'm going to show my greatness. Because no matter what, that greatness is within me. And the fact that it's being expected of me gives me more motivation to show it next time. So rather than just saying you're great and then leaving it at that, using greatness encourages this cultural model and reinforces this cultural model within the student population. So, in conclusion, at Math Corps, staff talk a lot about the concept of greatness, and they use this cultural model that has these 8 interdependent metaphorical and conceptual relationships. That's step 1, to show that Math Corps has a way of talking about greatness. Step 2, it's different than the discourse about greatness in other American English spoken and written contexts. So it is specific to Math Corps. I'm not saying that there couldn't be another program or another environment where it's spoken, but I certainly haven't found it, and I've looked quite a bit to find other environments where these sorts of relationships are frequently talked about. It doesn't occur in religious subcorpora of COCA, it doesn't occur in sports subcorpora of COCA, the places where I might look or you might think that people would talk about greatness, it's not there. Instead, the relationships I showed you about achieving and being destined for greatness are in general American English. That's step 2. Step 3 is that rapid transmission, that we recognize that this moves from staff to students fluidly, and then without prompting, students talk about greatness, not just that they use the word, but they use the same conceptual relationships, the same cultural model that the staff are using. And that's step 3. In step 4, there's graphic and gestural forms that reinforce that greatness is this entity within a person that can be shown. And you could show a lot of greatness, you could show a little bit of greatness, and it doesn't mean that you're done, it just means that you're on this upward path, this trend moving up and up and up, despite occasional failures. And that's step 4. And then 5, that we recognize that this metaphorical structure is particularly well suited for motivating student success in what is a very, very challenging educational and social environment of the Detroit public school system. Thank you.
That was time for questions.
Yeah, Tammy?
I'm just curious, in your research, do you think that this conceptual model has an organic genesis, or do you think it was consciously put forward by the founder of the program?
Well, I think it was organic, because when I pointed it out to the founder of the program, he was very surprised to hear about it. That's not to say there was no conscious thought behind it, but I don't think it was developed because it was read in a book, or that somebody said these are going to be the 8 great things about greatness. That I know is not true. I certainly think that some of these things have to, because it's a relatively small number of staff, you know, there are 4 staff who constitute the entire 74,000 word assembly corpus. There's obviously talk about it, and they talk amongst themselves, but, you know, for instance, some of those staff were former students. So we're not talking about some sort of thing that only one person did, and that somehow, and you don't get a handbook of how to talk about greatness. People learn about greatness gradually through long-term participation and through massive exposure. I mean, that's basically when I talk about this assembly corpus of 74,000 words, that means every 3 minutes you're hearing about greatness. And 71% of the time, they're going to use one of those 8 relationships. And most of the time when they're not, they're saying things like, yeah, let's talk about greatness for a while. Yeah, you know what we say about Math Corps, we're always talking about greatness. These don't have a conceptual relationship, but you hear it, and then you hear all these relationships, and they're very, very rapidly developed. Yeah, Gibran?
Oh, thank you very much. It is, it is a very, very beautiful presentation. But now, let me ask a question. From ethnographical view to, let us, to anthropological. Have you gone to some reading to see in a cross-cultural manner if this concept is internalized in some other culture? You have done that very well in your book regarding time, regarding hour. From Russia to France and to Rome and so on. Have you done this kind of anthropological approach to see some culture? Because I'm thinking, for example, the Jafon, the Yoruba, where I have worked, and my own native language, Creole, and French, and many of you speak French, they know they have ici anthropological.
Yeah, and I think this is a very interesting question. And the challenge is that in this field of conceptual metaphor theory, the work on translation and how do you translate conceptual metaphors from one language to another. There, the primary figure is Anna Wierstika, and who's worked a lot on how concepts such as anger might be in fact encoded quite differently or similarly across different languages. Now, for my part, I haven't done that here because really I'm interested in how MathCore does what it does with greatness. And of course, that concept of greatness is not going to have those same semantic entailments necessarily in different languages. For instance, the connection between greatness being bigness and also being goodness, it's not necessary. So, for instance, in Old English, the Old English word for big was mickle. And nobody says mickle anymore. It's disappeared. And so this concept has developed, particularly in English. It's not to say that there couldn't be other languages that have a similar set of conceptual relationships. For the purposes of this study, because it's focused on the MathCore, which is an English language environment primarily. I should say, however, though, that there is a small percentage, maybe less than 5% certainly, of students who are not native English speakers, but who might be native Arabic speakers or native Spanish speakers in MathCore. Now, they don't hear the word greatness translated, but it would be very interesting to know whether their conceptions of greatness differ on account of them having a different primary and first language.
Let me it will be very short.
Okay.
You know, while you were explaining, you know what concept come to mind? It is Latin magnus. It is so important to the Latin. You have Grégoire le Grand, Magnus. You have Léon le Grand, even the Pope. You have several popes, they are Magnus. And I believe some people already call John Paul II Magnus. I stop right there. Thank you.
Emma?
I wonder if I can invite you to extend a little bit of that conversation. Thank you for this forum, it's great. I had two thoughts. I was sitting here kind of grinding my teeth thinking this is great, and then you're going to get to something related to the notion of translation. So maybe I could invite you in the work you've done, think about, or talk briefly first about this in two ways. These are all exophoric kind of references. These are, insights that you gain by connecting us to data sets or corpuses that are external to the setting you're studying, and bringing up things like grit and all. It sounds like I could see John Wayne in your math. If you're going to script that, it's So in the process of translation as an idiom here, how would you extend this work to see the conversations about or settings where that frame is introduced as one where there's a socialization that goes on between the new entrants into the field, the ones that are sort of displaying and practicing and attempting to be sort of validated or confirmed in being part of the greatnesses, and then in the graduates, I'm wondering about the continuation afterwards. So there's one form in which the translation actually is a very apt idiom. And that's one thing I'd just be interested to hear more about, and perhaps that's in your field kind of engagements. The second one is, I'm always curious about this. I'm hung up on words. I can't help it. Most of the time I communicate poorly, and I rely on words. And so I'm wondering about, is there a category that these are not, that's being indexed in place of the overuse of the term greatness? Are they using that term as a way to talk around and about something else, right? And so I'm wondering when you're urging, or there's a hortatory kind of use of greatness, if in fact you're moving towards what the linguist Rampar would talk about as stance, or the displacement of those cultural models approaches by work on intentionality to see, what, where, and how those are indexing. So there's two questions. Maybe I'm suffering from the too many words thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how I can address the question of translation specifically. There's certainly, I'd love to know a lot more about the process of socialization and how these new participants in the program, you know, what they think coming in. Because of course I normally don't get them, you know, as quickly, you know, I don't get them on day one and, you know, get them registered in my study and, you know, get their consent forms and all that sort of stuff. So by the time I get them, you know, they're, you know, I could do a first interview with the kid maybe 10 or 12 days in, but as I've shown, they've already acquired at least a habit of talking about greatness in a particular way. And the question of what's being displaced or what's being, or you know, what would they be talking about? You know, not that greatness is replacing a single concept, but how do people talk, how do kids talk about their success and their failure and what happens when they're challenged? Which is, of course, the question I eventually